Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I am very happy to be joined with the one and only Malcolm Harris. How are you, Malcolm? Good to see you.
I'm well. Thanks for having me back, David.
Yeah, it's been a little while. I'm trying to think. It was maybe a couple years ago that you and I spoke. I remember having a really good time speaking with you. I'm hoping we can recreate the carnival atmosphere that we had last time. I want to I want to say the name of your book, although I don't know if I need to, man, because your book is everywhere these days. I mentioned in my email to you that we have a little lefty bookstore in our neighborhood that I walk by, and I see this book sort of gleaming out of the window for the last few weeks. It's called Palo Alto: A History of California, Capitalism, and the World. It's a majestic work. How long did it take you to write this? Can I start with that kind of question?
Well, I feel like I've been researching it my whole life,
Yeah.
so yeah, it was hard to like say this is when I started working on it. But I started writing in earnest in 2020. I signed the contract for it, I think, at the very beginning of the pandemic, basically.
I'm really glad you said that you've been researching it your whole life because reading it, I mean, it connects to a lot of the things we get into on this program, and we're not the only ones talking about this sort of stuff, but the intersection of our lives with the history of tech, and tech becoming not only a massive part of the American economy, but just a massive part of the experience of being alive in the moment that we happen to occupy. I guess a shared consensual reality. But you were born in 1988, and you sort of start the book off with a kind of reflection on that moment. Can you talk a little bit about that, because it does seem like our lives are implicated in this one way or the other.
Yeah, so I was born in '88. My parents met in and around Palo Alto, so I was sort of like a product of this place from the very beginning. Though I didn't actually live there till I was like 8 years old, but I spent a good part of my childhood living in Palo Alto. And so, for those of us without graduate degrees who want to write history books, one way to access the authority to do that work is you write about something that you have a personal connection to,
Mm.
and you weave the personal connection through the book to give yourself the legitimacy to tackle a subject that's complex and otherwise would leave people saying like, who are you and why should we believe what you say?
Right. Right.
Uh, and so when I originally pitched this book and sold this book, it was much more of that kind of work with a lot more of my story and reflections on my upbringing and my childhood throughout the history of Palo Alto, going back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't work for a number of reasons. And I feel to this day very grateful that my editor let me just like cut all that stuff out. And so I come in there a little bit at the beginning and a little bit at the end, but otherwise it's a pretty straight history, and it's from my perspective and my experience, but it's not about that.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say this is a for those that don't know what this book is about and what we're talking about here. Your book is a history of Palo Alto, California, that sort of uses Palo Alto as a window or a lens. I'm going to use a really annoying academic term, but a window or lens into a phase of capitalism and certain elements of what capitalism has become in the 21st century. But yeah, I would think it would be hard to weave yourself into that story, in part because God, I mean, you're starting in the 19th century. Like this is a story of American imperialism and manifest destiny and genocide of Native Americans and all things that I think we are implicated in one way or the other. But I would think it would be hard to sort of tell childhood stories alongside the 1850s, if that makes sense.
Well, that part was actually not the issue. And so I did write a bunch of these sections, and it was shockingly easy to put yourself into these stories. So I talk about, I went to Ohlone Elementary School, which was named for what the name they gave the indigenous people of the Bay Area, one of the
Mm-hmm.
names that's used for the indigenous people of the Bay Area. And in second and third grade, we play acted as the Ohlone. We smashed acorns, we toured the huts. And then in the next years, fourth and fifth grade, you play act as the settlers. And so part of California, and this is, statewide education standards or whatever,
Oh, I'm a dude. I built a mission in school.
Yep, exactly.
Which I guess people from other states don't necessarily do this, but they have their own rituals of sort of reminding themselves of what the whole history of the place is. But yeah,
Hmm.
built a
But the
mission.
California one
Yeah,
is important. And
it
so
is.
it's this very almost like Hegelian like procession of races through history education, where like in the lower grades you're the Indians, and then in the later grades you're the settlers, and one
Right.
transitions to the other, and you don't like play act the settlers killing the Indians, right? You don't do that part, and you don't reckon with these two groups of people existing in the same place at the same time. And that's a real like propagandistic approach, right? They're inserting this idea that this is a natural progression, even though nothing of the sort is true. And it never even happened, right? There were the descendants of indigenous people in that classroom with me while
Mm.
we are rehearsing their disappearance.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
and so,
Yeah. So that's good.
mapping those
You
next to each
are in this
other.
story. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think like, and for people who know me, uh, they'll be able to see me throughout the story, right? Even if I don't say,
Well, I can hear
I
your
talk,
voice, dude. Like you have a
well,
you have a
that's
kind
true.
of you have a kind of writing style that's very I don't know. It's very it just connects to a certain kind of I don't know, a kind of engagement with the reader that is fun and interesting. And I don't know. I can hear you in the pages of this thing. Another thing that I can hear in your book is and think about a lot is like Disneyland and like
Hmm.
it connects to. I mean, I was a kid going on a train, and we can get to some of your story here because it's like railroads and everything else. But like
Hmm.
like the Disneyland rides are very much like connected to this sort of frontier history and told in a very specific way that's connected to what you're saying. Like there are phases of history, and here's the phase when the Indians were living here, and then the settlers came, and it's told in
Hmm.
a. I mean, Disneyland. One of my friends referred to Disneyland as John Ford for kids, but it's sort of that story is told. I mean, California is just like over it's over determined in terms of how that history is present everywhere. I think maybe people that aren't from California don't understand that.
And I wanted to bring in specifically Northern California history because I feel like sometimes that history, because of the prominence of Hollywood in our national myth making, the story gets told south to north, and you almost see that Northern California as like a product of Southern California, when
Mm,
actually the reverse is the truth. And so Disneyland and the Hollywood industry is financed out of Northern California and out of the Central Valley and out of the agricultural regions, right? It's financed by the Bank of America. First, starting in San Francisco with like the Nickelodeon industry, right? With like they'll buy one and put one on the corner, but the entertainment industry is built out of Bay Area capital.
mm.
Just out of Southern California in general is built out of Bay Area capital because it does happen second, right? It
Yeah,
is NorCal then SoCal.
San Francisco is a city before Los Angeles is ever a city, right? This is like
Well, way before, and Los Angeles is only able to become the city that it becomes because of the prominence within national politics of people from Northern California, particularly Herbert Hoover,
mm,
who, literally channels the water that turns Southern California into Southern California that we know now, and is now, the Hoover Dam compact, the Colorado River compact around the Hoover Dam is now causing real problems, right? And part of the problems is the deal made to advantage Southern California and really bring it into existence, which again is the product of Northern California capital. So I wanted to tell the story NorCal first, and it's partly my partisanship, but I think partly it reflects the historical record.
yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about Las Vegas recently. So, the Hoover
Hmm.
Dam story is incredible, and doing research on it is sort of like I never understood quite the scale of the project that the Hoover Dam eventually became, and that it created this giant store of water and electricity that then made possible cities like LA and Phoenix and Santa Fe and all these places that sort of depended on this infrastructure. The story that you're telling is not just a sort of Ken Burnsian, and then they built the Hoover Dam, and that made
Hmm.
California possible. Instead, I feel like your story is really a pretty big intervention in the story of that capitalism and where it brought us today. I mean, it seems like tech. I don't know, how do we get our arms or hands or our minds or whatever around our bodies, our flesh, around what tech is? Because it seems like your story. Are you telling a story of tech from the 19th century to today? Because it seems like it's all, whether it be railroads or big hydroelectric dams or social media platforms, it seems like California is like an engine of a lot of that stuff.
Absolutely. And so the period that I'm telling that is coextensive with the history of Palo Alto is the history of planetary capitalism. And so there's a lot of debate about where and when capitalism starts, even like what century and what
Mm-hmm.
continent.
Yeah.
There are like lots of many. I just read a really great piece in the monthly review about the fisheries of Newfoundland and the role of the fisheries of Newfoundland and the colonial extraction from the fisheries of Newfoundland in the role of creating capitalism and like the financed fishing
Mm.
barges in the 16th century, the 17th century. Uh,
Incredible. Yeah.
Right. And like, so there are tons of debates about where we can find, the beginning of capitalist practices, but there's not a lot of debate about where and when you have the planetary system of capitalism start, which is in the mid 19th century with the incorporation of the Pacific, California, China, Japan, Australia into the capitalist system. And so that's when the capitalism gets its arms around the world, and the world is brought, all the peoples of the world brought into a unified system of production and distribution for the first time in human history.
Mm.
That happens not just at the same time as California, but with California, right? California is the center of that story. And California goes from being the furthest edge of the world, right? The last place the capital shows up. And really, like, Spanish colonization is really thin in Alta California. Mexican control of Alta California is very thin. You still got most of the land occupied by indigenous people who are living there, 150,000 at the point. You've got the
Mm-hmm.
missions, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
real coastal presence, and it's not able to absorb the labor and the livelihoods of all the people who live there, who still are finding time to integrate their traditional existence into this, colonial situation. And that changes when capitalism shows up. Like,
Mm.
capitalism is a new system, and it wipes everything else away. It incorporates elements of the Spanish system, maybe like culturally or whatever, but economically, absolutely not. Right? It starts a new thing, and very quickly, this last corner of the world becomes now the center of a new world system. And as the last part to be included into capitalism, it now becomes this birthplace for all sorts of new technologies. And so from the very beginning of its incorporation into the capitalist world system, California is a center of capitalist technology.
Mm.
And so you can look at mining engineering and
Mm-hmm.
mining engineering that's developed around the gold rush. But then you can also look at the agricultural that's being developed around the same time, and horse genetics, and the transition from commodity wheat to like fruits and nuts is a total like technology question. But they're also developing technologies of labor market control, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
racialization. They're developing technologies of global labor flows, and whiteness is being created. And so a lot of these technologies that I'm talking about that elevate California to the center of this new world in some ways much earlier than I had anticipated in doing this history, right? That this
Yeah.
place does become much more important to the whole world way faster than I think most of the history offers, which is usually a post World War II story.
I
But
think
like,
that's, yeah, I think that's what I appreciate most about your book, honestly, is that it sort of reperiodizes how we think about the history of California and how we think about the history of technology. Because yeah, you could very easily, I think, be like, well, I'm going to start the story of tech in California. Let's talk about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, or
mhm,
something like that, which is a story that you and I grew up with. I mean,
yeah,
I'm a little bit older than you, but I grew up with like, tech as something that's happening now, rather than sort of like this putting it in the context of what you're writing about, which is to me, I want to pick up on the other thing you just mentioned, which is really important. I think it's not just tech and like capitalism and all those things. It's sort of it seems like what you're describing is a melding of like the tech and all the sort of economic practices with the ideology of indigenous erasure and all the sort of Disneyland story we talk about. Seems like it's melding to a story of technological progress too. And I wanted to mention, if we can go through it, trace a little bit of this for people. Like, when would we say, quote unquote, capitalism comes to California? I mean, part of the story you're telling seems like is of these like Civil War era, Gilded Age, robber baron type dudes who are coming to California and they see opportunity beyond opportunity. Leland Stanford is the guy that seems like he's a central figure in your book because he's implicated in all of this. But where does he come from and what does he do? Because I noticed you also talk about like figures like John C. Fremont, and part of me is like sort of thinking, okay, this is the end of the Civil War. The Republican Party is empowered. The West is now under the control of the U.S. federal government. Like, you can sort of see like a carpet is laid out for a certain kind of development. But who are these motherfuckers and what are they up to at this time?
Yeah, they're really lucky, right? And that's the story of Leland Stanford Sr. more than anything, is that he's a really lucky guy, historically wise, and he becomes this avatar of West Coast capital. And if you think of like the guy in the suit with the top hat and the watch chain, he's got his like big broad belly and the beard and
the Monopoly guy, basically.
Yeah, right. That Leland Stanford was that guy. Like, he played that guy, and his job was to play that guy. And he came to that role again by being lucky. And so he's born into this family that owns a tavern that happens to be next to what becomes the Erie Canal. And so they go from, tavern owners to being the tavern next to the Erie Canal, and suddenly you're a much wealthier business owner, which means your sons get to go to college.
There's such poetry to that, honestly. Like, because it's like the canal, like this guy is going to be the bridge of like the canal age to the railroad age, and the canal being the like central, like the reason why they get rich is because there's like commerce on the canal. That's amazing.
Yeah, and and it takes a while, obviously, for him to get from, the son of a family that happens to own a, good restaurant and an inn or whatever to who he becomes. And again, he has to get pretty lucky for that to happen. And it's not because he's particularly skilled, which he's not. He has a few like failed careers. And he ends up following his older brothers out to California, where they had become small-time merchants. And if you learn, part of the ideological education you get about the gold rush period, especially in California schools, is that it's not about just taking the gold out of the land. Anyone can do that, which isn't true, but anyone can pull the gold out of the land. The really smart people are the ones who started businesses and sold stuff to the gold miners, and they were the ones who persisted. The Levi Strausses, you sell the jeans, sell the shovels, etc. I remember being taught that very explicitly 4th, 5th grade.
Yeah, me too. And I mean, I hadn't thought about it in a long time, but I was like, wow, the story of jeans and the story of San Francisco. Now I am sort of like remembering a teacher in elementary school being like, and what's the name of our football team in California? And like, well, the 49ers. Well, why is that? And it began the conversation of like remembering that's when California was settled. And that's when this like very romantic time of people looking for gold in the mountains. I mean, at Knott's Berry Farm, you literally like pan for gold. You still reenact that there. Yep. And I did that as a kid, and it's sort of, I don't know, it's insane.
And you
to
still
think
you might find some, right? You're like holding out hope, like I could find.
It's a
metaphor. And they show you some, right? And at the thing, they always show you. It's like some kid a couple years ago found one, like could be you.
And it's in fucking nature too, right? Like it's like literally like go up in the woods and get down on your knees in a river, and like it's like what could be more self-sufficient and individualistic and rugged than that? Yeah.
Even though again that's very quickly got supplanted by these like shop owners who are relatively heady capital on the West. But the role that California is playing to the United States, especially before the Transcontinental Railroad, right after colonization, but before the Transcontinental Railroad, is this, it's an overseas colony,
Mm,
like pretty literally. And
mm.
so, if you have to go overland east to west to get out to California before the transcontinental is there, that's unlucky. Yeah, that's because you're broke, right? If you have the money, you go south by ship across Nicaragua and then up the coast by ship. Like, it is literally an overseas colony. Sacramento to Washington, D.C. is way, way, way further than Paris to Algiers. And
Mm.
Algeria is, colonized by France at almost exactly the same time, right? Mid 1850, mid 1840, can't remember, late 1840s.
Doesn't matter,
Uh,
somewhere in there. But yeah, I get it.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
an amazing point though. The idea of like just the distance and time of what it takes, and just those settlers coming across the desert are like the ragged people that have to do it.
Well, and most people were not intending to be settlers. And so the 49ers were not mostly intending to be settlers. And that was true for the Anglos as well as uh, 49ers from all over, right? If you're coming from China, you got a quicker route to the gold fields of NorCal than
Mm.
someone coming from, the East Coast of the United States. Certainly than
Right.
someone coming from Europe through the East Coast of the United States. Like, it's just straight across the Pacific. It's right there. And the same is true if you're coming from Sonora, right? If you're coming from northern Mexico and you're a miner in northern Mexico, of which there were many, right? Same thing if you're,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even true if you're coming from Chile. That's one boat ride instead of two boat rides and an overland trek if you're coming from the West Coast. So there are a lot of places that are at least as what we can think of as close to here as the Anglo-Americans.
Mm.
But the Anglo-Americans have this, tool of capital that they're using and very quickly use it to colonize the space and to exclude other people. They introduce a foreign miners tax that make it difficult for other people to mine the same places even before the mines themselves are exhausted. Um,
It would make sense though in this context. I never really thought about it this way, but it makes sense that there's such an anti-Chinese sentiment among Anglo people in power because Chinese people can easily access California, right? Like, or more easily access it, or access it in a way with numbers that other groups are not at that moment. At
yeah,
least.
well,
Yeah.
especially for the settlers and the 49ers who were coming. I mean, actually, it was the upper class, the ruling Republican clique led by Leland Stanford that brings in more Chinese workers. They're very happy to bring in Chinese workers to build the railroad because they are in fact dependent on Chinese workers. They're the best construction workers you could afford, and ones that would actually stick by the project and not go join whatever mine strike popped
Mm.
off in the West somewhere, because again, they were ineligible to participate because Anglo miners would kick them out.
Mm.
And so they became a very reliable construction workforce. And it was also because of the way that the Chinese workforce was organized through labor contractors. Um,
It
and
seems like
so,
running from strikes and sort of organizing or unorganizing labor is a major part of what the capitalists are doing in California at this moment. I mean, if we can get to Palo Alto, how is that place founded? Because it seems like part of the story that you're telling is of Leland Stanford essentially looking for a place to get away from labor organization.
absolutely. And it was a direct result of the tensions we're talking about, which is that he was held responsible for importing Chinese workers, which then damaged the position of white settlers on the labor market, which was, in some ways true, right? That's a real thing that happened and that he did on purpose. And he was the one who was sort of publicly blamed because he was the least capable out of the clique of capitalists. They called themselves the associates,
Mm.
who were building this railroad. They were Sacramento shop owners who got together and backed this plan to build half of the transcontinental railroad. And then when the Civil War kicks off, the Union supports this northern route led by these Republican businessmen, and they become very important. Leland Stanford becomes a governor. But the other guys put him out in front because he's not very clever, and because they knew that eventually the bill was going to come due for all the corruption that they were doing and how they were getting rich off these public contracts.
Mm.
which was not in a straightforward way at all. It was through, auxiliary companies that was selling rails, or they were the land development companies that was speculating on land, or, corruption. And they put Leland Stanford out in front, figuring if someone gets in trouble, it should be Leland.
Oof.
And Leland lived with his family, his wife Jane, and their young son Leland Stanford Jr. on Nob Hill in San Francisco, which is still there, and it's short for Nabob Hill, which is what they called it then. Which is Nabob was like means rich guys. And big mansion on Nob Hill, and the Working Men's Party, which was this white labor organization in the 1870s, would come demonstrate outside his house and say, Leland Stanford, you got 1 week to expel the Chinese workers or else, and keep threatening him. In the 1870s, both in the United States and abroad, is a time of real militant class struggle. And like, just as workers are being proletarianized into the city, they're struggling about what that means. And so 1871 is the Paris Commune. There's class conflict, militant class conflict, deadly class conflict around the United States and cities. And so the threat of these guys showing up outside your house all the time, even if you've got the police on your side, which the Stanfords did, is a real threat. And so Leland does what rich guys do when they're faced with the class tensions that they cause, which is move his family to the suburbs. But the suburbs don't exist yet. And so he has to create a suburb to move his family to in the 1870s. And that's what Palo Alto is. Palo Alto is the product of these class tensions and the solution to the people coming outside your house and yelling at you.
Wow.
And in Palo Alto, in his thousands of acres, I think it starts at 11,000 and goes to 8,000. Everyone works for you, right? It's a sort of feudal setup, as opposed to in the city where like people work for capital, but like individual workers might still threaten you and you can't fire anyone from their job or whatever. But here if you control thousands of acres of this space, no one on there, doesn't have to answer to you.
Dude, it's like a fucking slave plantation. But it reminds me of Walt Disney too, because Walt Disney, like he was a visionary of like Epcot Center and these sort of like futuristic utopias. And people would ask him, what about the politics, the labor and all that? And he's like, there won't be politics. Everyone will be taken care of. Everyone will be happy. It's just all taken care of. And I'm like, that sounds like the logic of a family or a plantation. It's really interesting to me that at the same time, Leland Stanford and figures like this are creating this like massively alienating system and creating this working class. At the same time, they're sort of in denial about it or running and trying to like live away from it, I guess, if that makes sense. I like your idea of like he's one of the original like guys going to the suburbs, but there's no suburbs, so you got to build it.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many like really compelling things there, but one of them that you mentioned is like these shop owners, because like how much should we think of this as like a top-down thing being created by the evil Gilded Age capitalists, but also like these settlers and shop owners and people who are like demanding this. Because it seems like that idea of like shop owners coming together, that like petty bourgeois, like middle class guys who are saying, hey, we could get even more if we had a fucking railroad built. Why don't we make the federal government build a railroad? It seems like that class is really, really important in all of this.
Yeah, well, and that you have this settler capitalist class, which is relatively petty compared to global capital, right? It's very easy to die out there, right? And it's pretty gross, and there aren't very many women.
Yeah.
And like literally, it's an underdeveloped place. It's the
rough.
Colonies, as far as the United States is concerned, in the same way that for other like imperial countries had colonies where young men who wanted to, try their chance would go try to like build something because they had better odds there, but they were taking a big risk, with their lives. And that's sort of what happened with this capitalist class, the settler capitalist class, is that they're the ones who succeeded. But when they build this transcontinental railroad, which connects the markets of the West Coast to the markets of the East Coast, and including the labor markets, that changes the situation very quickly. And you go from having this like isolated overseas colony to then being linked to capital itself. And to build that and to take on the next stage, California is able to absorb tons and tons and tons and tons of capital from this now integrated financial system. So they're taking capital in from Europe, they're taking it through the East Coast, through Wall Street, and people are investing tons and tons of money in railroad securities, and then later in the financial instruments that are produced by the success of the railroads.
Mm.
And so you read, you can read Proust, read Proust, and they're talking about like, oh, I got to check on my like railroad bonds. Like, let's see
Right.
how my railroads in the United States are doing.
Uh,
And so it's not like it's not disconnected from the capital system. It's from the beginning, it's playing this role for capital
mhm.
in service of global capital.
Okay, so we can't spend all our time in the 19th century. We got to get to
No,
the
it's
20.
true.
We got to get to the 20th century. That era just is fascinating to me in part because, yeah, like we said, if you live in California, the evidence of it is visually everywhere. I mean, there are like red tile Spanish roofs and this sort of weird engagement with that era, and Native American practices sort of as a kind of decorative iconography everywhere. But your story too, it gets to some of the juicy stuff of like what our lives entail in 20th and 21st centuries in terms of, I don't know, that post World War II era. How much is Stanford University a center of all this? Because it seems like, I don't know, one of the stories we often tell on this show, and I guess in the general like boomer sort of Forrest Gumpian sort of story we all know is that California, and specifically Northern California, like San Francisco, was sort of like popped off with all this counterculture energy in the 60s. And in part, it was in response to, beyond the like civil rights stuff and Vietnam War, before that, it was like, I don't know, you mentioned C. Wright Mills and the like sort of alienation that comes with a technocratic world, but also like the people at Berkeley, and I wonder if it was true at Stanford too. We're starting to become aware of their university as connected to the military industrial complex and connected to nuclear research facilities and things like that. So how much is Stanford a part of that story? I know it's a big part of that story, but it seems like Stanford is like a, by the time we fast forward past that railroad age, we're entering an age in which Stanford is becoming connected to the federal government and connected to tech in a very different way, right?
Yeah, and it becomes the archetypical Cold War university, maybe along with MIT or Caltech, but Stanford, and now I think looking back, now that we can look back on the 20th century, really Stanford more than anyone else becomes this Cold War university and sets up the relationship between university, private industry, and the federal government, especially around military spending and military research, which is the core of all this stuff. But that's partly because of Stanford's legacy as an like anti-New Deal holdout during the era of big science, which because of the role that Herbert Hoover plays at the school is really like antagonistic towards the Roosevelt administration and doesn't want a part of the like big university, big science era that's controlled by Washington. That's like the social democratic era investment. They keep their distance at a time when there's a lot of investment into this world, maybe working through like subcontracts and stuff like that, where they don't have to come under the regulatory gaze of the social democratic state at its height, because they're really resentful of those institutions and don't want to answer to the government and don't want to answer to
Why are they
the people.
resentful of the New Deal coalition?
Well, for one thing, it kicks Herbert Hoover out of office, right? So Herbert Hoover is the avatar of Stanford University. He's part of the first class of the school, and he's really responsible for the elevation of the university in the beginning of the 20th century. And Roosevelt kicks him out, and Hoover, who has continued to invest in Stanford and Palo Alto throughout his whole career, becomes convinced that social democracy and communism, worldwide communism, and anti-colonialism are all one thing. And economic democracy is all one thing, and then he has to fight back against them. And he secures the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he, re-endows it as a center of anti-Marxism, for the American project.
So how much should we connect? How much should we connect the like anti-communist Elon Musk sort of streak of whatever Silicon Valley is today in the popular imagination. You can include Peter Thiel in there too. How much should we connect that? Because it seems like a
Direct.
strain, yeah,
It's
right from the
directly
beginning.
connected. Oh
Yeah,
yeah. Well, and so Peter Thiel was a a member of the board of overseers at the Hoover Institution at Stanford,
amazing.
right? Well, and Harlan Crow, who we're talking about now, is Clarence Thomas's best bud, also board of overseers at Hoover. Like this is the sort of right wing conspiracy infrastructure. A lot of it is run out of Stanford University and is around this military industrial complex that gets developed in this post-war era, where since they've brushed off the big science social democracy era, they're able to really step up during this Cold War era where now subcontractors are leading the way, and they're able to build um, this relationship with the federal government that's based on a industrial policy that's real finance military based.
Yeah.
And so they build the Stanford Industrial Park at Stanford. Frederick Terman, the provost, leads the creation of this industrial park, which includes a lot of high-tech industry that are subcontractors to the military industrial complex. And these firms in this like sector of industry, though it begins as just an adjunct to the like prime military contractors that are really like taking the brunt of this investment, then begins to eclipse those contractors in the Cold War era as like anti-communism becomes the dominant belief system for US politics.
Right.
And like Hoover gets his revenge in this period as like Rooseveltism goes by the side and Nixon turns into Reagan. And Reagan, is really brought into the White House in a shady back room at the Hoover Institution. He's a culmination of this Hoover project, as is George W. Bush, brought in a remarkably similar set of meetings
And we
to
don't think,
Reagan.
of those figures, George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, as creations of Silicon Valley, right? Like that's not how we think of them at all. And yet, what you're describing here is something like, in terms of just the practical power structures of their campaigns and what they're doing. It seems like it's a big part of understanding this story.
Yeah, and it's important to see the continuity with Hoover and Hooverism and this power base that's built out of Palo Alto by Hoover because he's a member of the first class at Stanford University. 1891, you got
What the
Hoover
fuck?
there.
Nobody knows anything about Herbert Hoover beyond like he fucked up the Great Depression, right? Like that's
Well,
really
unless they read my book, now you'll find dozens of pages about Herbert Hoover, which I did not really intend to write, but his legacy ends up being really important. And we can look back now, I think, in the 21st century and say like, he won, right? We don't like who won the 20th century. This conventional story is Roosevelt beats Hoover in 32 and, charts the way forward for America in the 20th century. But Hoover outlives Roosevelt, both literally, right? He literally lives into the 60s. And I think both in terms of also in terms of his political power.
Well, I know that Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of Interior during the Roosevelt administration, he hated the fact that the Hoover Dam was called the Hoover Dam because it was completed in 1935. It was built almost entirely after the Hoover administration, he even wrote like New York Times editorials. And once Roosevelt was dead, though, in 1947, I think it was. I just read this. I'm sorry, I'm sharing my Wikipedia facts, but like in 1947 is when it's officially named the Hoover Dam, and they've secured that legacy. It seems like an important one.
They changed it back. So when it's first commissioned, it's named the Hoover Dam, and then Roosevelt, Ickes and Roosevelt unname it. They take Hoover's name off the dam, which again, like
so fucking petty,
brutal for Hoover, right? And it's funny because it's like it also reflects this historical transition, which is that we don't acknowledge how Hooverite, or we're just beginning to acknowledge how Hooverite actually all the Roosevelt programs really were. And that the housing program that Roosevelt does, we're starting to understand that like, oh, it was like limited based on its how it worked with real estate capital and how it excluded non-white people. But
Interesting.
we don't quite understand that that's because like Hoover set it up, right? That these were structures that were set up under the Hoover administration. And the Hoover Dam is a great example of like a large scale public works project by this right-wing Republican, pro-market president. You talk about the Tennessee Valley Authority and all the public projects under FDR without acknowledging that Hoover's doing it first, right? That Hoover had sort of set the ground for this with the dam, and which he understood very, very differently. And it is
Mm.
different from the TVA, of course, but
Mhm.
in general, the way that American industrial policy is done and public investment is done is much more Hooverite than it is, Rooseveltian, if we think of Rooseveltian as the TVA.
Right, right. No, that's great. I'm glad we got that out because that all that public works stuff, I don't know, it connects in such really terrifying ways to me to the history we're in today because you talk about like Lake Mead, which is the reservoir that's created by Hoover Dam, shrinking and shrinking, and I know it got a little bit of water this year, but the overall sort of story of Lake Mead shrinking isn't just because of climate change; it's because of demand. That there are now 40 million people that are getting water from this reservoir that was never planned for. And so, like to me, like your story kind of gives us the sort of understanding of the steps along the way of sort of writing us into the cul-de-sac we find ourselves in the 21st century, if that makes sense. Because it's sort of a story of capitalism that's not really planning for a future like we're in now, or it created it, I guess.
Well, yeah, it was we have to understand why we're in the solution or why we're in the situation we're in now. We have to understand what our problems were a solution to, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we think about Palo Alto as a problem, it's more important. I mean, it's obvious in the ways that it's problematic, right? We can, and I talk about them throughout the book, and
That should have been
certainly
the
in the
name of the book.
conclusion. Yeah, Palo Alto is problematic. So it's obvious the ways that it's a problem. I talk about a lot of the ways that it's a problem, but it's more important for me writing this book uh, to have people understand the ways that it's a solution.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by
Because
that?
and so Palo Alto is a solution to the problem of the 20th century. And Du Bois says the problem of the 20th century is the color line.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can put it analogously, or another way of saying that maybe is that if you go back 100 years, ruling classes, ruling cliques encountered a world in which they felt very insecure. It was a very, very scary world for elites 100 years ago because they're looking at a world that is now one world. The liberal project is now extending out of their control. You've got anti-colonialism on the march. You've got communism on the march. And this question of how do you maintain an unequal position in the world for some people, whether that be Americans or white people or men or Europeans or Anglo-Saxons or however you're conceiving of it, how do you maintain an unequal position for some people in a world where everyone knows about each other? And that's a hard conceptual question. And they were really thinking about it. And I think if you put that to a lot of these ruling people at the time, they'd tell you that it was a really hard problem, right? That they didn't really expect that this was something that they were going to be hard pressed to figure out.
Is it just
And
kind of like the impossibility of the scale of the system and the feeling that we're not going to be able to shore up the kind of like sort of outbursts of civil unrest or famine and all sorts? In other words, is it sort of an anxiety about managing a global system?
well, not just managing it, but it's a question of subordinating other people. And
Having the
so if
winners
you,
and the losers and making
yeah,
sure
yeah,
we're the winners. Yeah.
if you colonize the world and then people decide like, okay, well, we know you and we're in the same world as you and we can kick you out, right? How do you maintain control
Yeah.
for a white global minority, right? Like,
I mean, I think we're seeing that an outburst of that class right now, right? Is sort of, I mean, it seems like part of the political discourse, not only in the United States, I think it's global too, but in the United States, we have a particular strain of it, is that kind of anxiety of like, we're losing control of the power that we've historically had.
And it's a constant problem, right? It is the constant problem for people who want to maintain unequal power in a
Mm-hmm.
world in which some of us believe, and I believe it is factually the case, that all people are qualitatively equal, right? And if you believe that all people are equal, then the only way that you can maintain a privilege for some is
Yeah.
through, force or trickery or whatever. Or you also
And make it
find
seem
ways to
natural
tell
too.
stories.
Like that seems like an important
Right.
thing as well, right? I mean, all these Disneyland stories we're telling, it seems like it's a story of like just this is just evolution, right? And it seems like
Hmm.
a really really key part of all of this because I want to get to the Silicon Valley that we all know as people that grew up with the internet. It seems like that's part of it too.
Absolutely. And eugenics is a story throughout this story, and they're, coming up with constantly, both in the first half of the 20th century and then again in the later half of the 20th century, and then again now in the 21st century, stories about how that story isn't true, about how people are not equal, and about how
Mm,
there are natural hierarchies and
mm,
how they can claim to discover them,
mm.
whether that's by, massive IQ testing or by genetic testing, or, these the claims about where that inequality can be found change. Uh, but Palo Alto and Stanford in particular is constantly looking for new ground on which to found those ideas.
So how do we graft this onto the kind of hokey story that we are often told, and I think less and less now. But we're still, I think we still understand tech as progress, and the internet as something that came to connect people and create a kind of world that we all want to live in. There's a sort of like, in other words, there's a utopianism connected to the early internet and the Steve Jobs stuff and the sort of like post 60s. It seems like, the story you're telling is one of the military industrial complex. The story you're telling is one that is connected directly to the forces that we typically think the internet was trying to challenge. What I mean by that is like there's like the counterculture story of like these
Mm-hmm.
60s radicals that come out of that come or come to Northern California in the late 60s and 70s and start building cybernetic systems. And they're basing their ideas on Marshall McLuhan. And they're sort of doing all this sort of hippie stuff. And there was like this idea that, I don't know, Apple and these other companies were going to create technologies that overcame all of the divisions and things that had happened in the 60s, the Vietnam War. You know the story. I'm not telling you anything
Yeah, I
new.
know,
But
I know it well. Well, and there are a couple of versions. There's the good version, and the bad version, because there's the version that you're telling where it's like, the Grateful Dead lyricists invented
yes,
the computer and the internet, and like that's
yes.
awesome. And now we live in their world, and isn't that cool? It's not like the stultifying world of the IBM,
Right.
big iron, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the other version, the sort of Adam Curtis, Californian ideology one, where the people your listeners might be more familiar with, even,
Right.
where it's like these feckless hippies are individualists, and like through their unthinking self-expression created the internet and individualism and neoliberalism and the personal computer and all this stuff. uh
That's the anti-boomer version.
right.
You're right. That is very Adam Curtis. It's kind of like
And
he sees all the social media stuff as just making capital richer. It doesn't really challenge the system. Like, yeah, he's got the opposite view for sure.
and I don't think that, and I don't tell either of those stories in this book, because I don't think those are really what was going on. That's not what was
Mm,
important. What was
mm.
important was this struggle of the color line, right? That was the Cold War, was what was important. Um, and this
I love that.
technology
Yeah,
is
I love the fact
very
that you're
important in that.
pointing out that race isn't present in either one of these big stories, right? And that you kind of need to understand that part of it because it seems like central.
And then if you listen to or you read the documents of the New Left, at the time, what they're actually talking about, and not the counterculture, which is a much broader thing that overlaps in some ways with the New Left, but is in no way coextensive. They're talking about race constantly, and global imperialism constantly, and the role of the United States in South Asia in particular, right? In Vietnam, and what the Cold War meant, but also in Latin America, also in Africa. Uh, and these were very smart people, diligent researchers who built up a deep understanding of the role of the tech industry of Palo Alto, of Stanford, in imperialism, in the Cold War, and the story that they're telling about what these technologies were for and how they were developed and the impersonal forces uh, that built them and the problems they existed to solve is a much, much more compelling story to me than the ones that we hear about the hippies and, personal thinking or whatever, like
Well, you get
individual,
into
whatever, developers.
Yeah, I feel like those stories are just sort of really kind of broad flattening of the phenomenon you're describing, which is much more, I don't know, I don't use the word dialectic, but it seems like there's a lot of contradictions and tensions written through all of this stuff. Do you know the figure Terence McKenna?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I mean, he figures into this, right? Like, it seems like he's a part of this story and a figure one way or the other that sort of, I don't know, captures a little bit of the contradictions, I guess, within the ideas of progress and futurism and things that are coming out of the Bay. Because I don't know, I guess the thing I'm getting to is like the kind of psychedelic element of it, like drug element of it. Where does that fit into this? Because it seems like some of these dudes were kind of like psychedelic cult guys that were sort of envisioning cybernetics or technology as a sort of way out or a kind of connecting to the drug experience, if that makes sense.
They tell the story. I don't think it's a particularly relevant historical story, and so I
Yeah.
don't tell it because I think it's
Right.
wrong. And so what I'm looking again is the role of and I talk about LSD because it's important in Palo
Yeah.
Alto. It's an interesting story, but I'm talking about, again, relative to this Cold War project, and Palo Alto and Stanford and the industry become obsessed with LSD because it's so powerful. And this is an area that's obsessed, again, with natural hierarchy, with power. And they
Yeah, I guess I'm
see
trying to figure
LSD.
out where people like McKenna are in that whole world, if that makes sense. Not him personally, but just the whole LSD revolution, because it does seem like the federal government and figures within capitalism are interested in it too.
Well, interested in it first. They are the ones. So these other guys are not the prime movers. They're sort of the story we tell later, to territorialize it, right? To make sense of this story without talking about what was actually going on, which was how do they wanted to figure out how do you use this powerful, super powerful compound to win the Cold War for America, right? How do you use it to subordinate the Vietnamese, right? Like, literally. And so they had two ways of researching that. One was, does it work to torture people? Can you use it to extract information from enemies? This is such a powerful compound. Let's see if it works. And they do experiments in prisoner of war camps, and they do experiments in US hospitals to see if you could use this on enemy combatants to torture them, which was sort of inconclusive. They found that you like drive people crazy or kill them, and it's not particularly useful. And Whitey Bulger is a product of these experiments. Ted Kaczynski is a product of these experiments. Like, they go badly in a couple ways, and with enduring consequences in America. But the other way that they use it is what we think of as microdosing, was invented at the very beginning of the product experimentations with LSD, which was to augment US knowledge workers in the Cold War struggle, right? This is around the Sputnik era, when they're very, very invested in developing US technicians, US, science and technology workers who will allow us to catch up with the Russians. And so they're experimenting on giving LSD to architects, giving LSD to computer programmers. Can you get people to think outside the box and be more creative if they take a little acid?
It's to me. I mean, I guess that's what I'm sort of trying to square with, the McKenna shit or the counterculture shit or the bottom up acid sort of story, because so much of it is about, oh, well, psychedelics are here and they're going to decondition us from the values of the Cold War. They're gonna actually break the mind spell of the military industrial complex. At the very same time, powerful people who arguably created LSD or a part of creating it are doing exactly the opposite. To me, that's the fascinating contradiction of that era to me.
Yeah, well, and that one, it doesn't strike me as so much a contradiction as they're just like liars, right? So like someone like Ken Kesey is like, or they don't understand their role in their historical project very well. And so someone
Mm,
like Ken Kesey, who's like a counterculture LSD guy, who's also pro-war, pro-America, straight up. Stuart Brand, counterculture LSD guy,
yeah.
pro-war, pro-America, straight up. Like these people, and anti-communists, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
They're part of a contrary project. They are the part of the project that the military industrial LSD complex uh, with computers is trying to create. And so it's not that that there's something contradictory about it. They're straight up. They're like, yeah, use acid for America. And if you study the LSD, that's like a lot of what was going on. So the Alternative Futures program that was run out of SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, is doing like pro LSD experimentation at the same time that it's spying on the new left as part of like anti-communist work, as part of its same time as it's developing counterinsurgency strategies for use in
Yeah.
Vietnam.
Yeah.
I don't think I included, there's an anecdote in one of the LSD histories that I don't think I included about a Rand analyst talking about taking acid and mapping in his mind on his wonderful acid trip, bombing routes over Maoist China.
Rock and roll, man. Yeah.
Right. And that's what it
Fucking
was for.
crazy.
And he was like, man, I had the best fucking trip. I saw how we're going to defeat Mao.
Well, I mean, this certainly sheds light on this sort of like phenomenon of Burning Man to me, and something that seems like Burning Man. For those that weren't alive during this era or were too young to remember, Burning Man in the 90s, I feel like was just like this punk rock thing to do, which is go out to the desert and sort of like take drugs and party and that sort of thing, but it seems like it emerged from Northern California, right? Like this, I feel like it was originally in San Francisco. Is that right?
Well, it came certainly out of that milieu. And so we
Yeah,
can draw it back. I'm interested in drawing that back to sort of the Bohemian Grove type stuff,
there
right?
you
So
go.
these
Yeah.
like associations of like, let's go into wilderness and take off our clothes and be capitalists
What the fuck?
around each other is, I mean, yeah, well, there's some choice words from Richard Nixon about Bohemian Grove and the stuff they did there that I thought were
Mm,
pretty funny that I won't
yeah.
quote on the tape. But
In very
it's
Nixonian language. Yeah, I've heard
yeah,
those
yeah,
tapes.
it's part of the practice of developing these associational connections between capitalists, right? You like see each other naked and it's easier to like make deals where you maintain your collective class position because these
Ooh, there's
people
a
are
lot going on there.
constantly tempted to stab each other in the back, and we saw this with the Silicon Valley bank run. Like they all have to, especially when it's built on so many layers of puffy finance stuff, they really have to all stick together or else it all falls apart. And one of
So
the
Burning
ways you
Man
get
is
people to
getting
stick
naked
together is
together. Yeah.
you go do drugs in the desert. Another way is you make sure that you're like knitted together through all sorts of like overlapping directorates. You make sure you've got the same bankers. You make sure you've got the same lawyers.
Well,
There are
it seems
lots of
like
ways
it's
to
like
connect.
being in a fraternity. As I approach the
Some of
age
them are literally in the
yeah,
same fraternities.
as I approach the age I am, realizing, I'm not connected really at all. I realized, man, I hated frat boys when I was a kid, when I was in college, but maybe I should have been a part of them because then I would have like this network of dudes that I could call up and get me jobs and things like that. And it seems like that's exactly the purpose it serves. And that God, it's Burning Man in the 90s for a young, dumb kid like me was like, oh, that sounds cool. I want to go out in the desert and do drugs and
Yo,
party.
totally. I
And
remember my brother and I, like early 2000s, when we were teenagers, like, yo, let's just drive out to Burning Man. And then it sounds tight. And then we like looked it up and we were like, $300,
it's
like
really
I'm not
expensive
paying
to
for
go to
that.
Burning Man. Yeah, no, I realized that I was like, this is going to be like $1,500, $2,000, something like that for me to go out and party in the desert. Like that doesn't sound like anarchy to me.
No.
It sounds like capitalism.
Right. Well, it is one of these associational structures that underlies the milieu. And we should like look at those because there are a bunch of them and it really speaks to the structure of the whole endeavor, the whole operation.
The clubs, the Proud Boys, the fraternal organizations. I was just reading
Well,
because
and Stanford University really is what is the ultimate one that collects
yeah,
them
and
all
that's
together. I mean, that can like we can tie it back to the end. I probably got to go in a minute, but
yeah, no, an hour goes really fast with you, Malcolm. And you're right. I mean, I think Stanford is the ultimate fraternal organization for capitalism, and we talk a lot on this show about like this idea of Californication and capitalism and a very particular brand of capitalism coming out of California. And when we saw my friend and I, Justin and I, who's a frequent co-host, when we saw your book, we were both just like, dude. Malcolm wrote the Californication book. Malcolm wrote the book that like tells the history of this state and why it's so vital and important to understanding the place we're in with global capitalism. And it's such a different story than the kind of frontier mythology that we often get around California. So thank you. Yeah, we could talk forever about this stuff, but it's a really important book. And I appreciate you coming on talking with me, Malcolm.
yeah, thanks so much for exploring it. We could like 5 to 7 hours, I bet, go straight through, but my voice would just straight
Yeah,
up give
because the
out.
Burning Man shit, and the drug stuff, it's sort of interesting to me to be like, wait a second, like, the story I was told of kind of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll of a
Mm-hmm.
counterculture in the '60s is very, very different than what I thought, and definitely connects to the kind of politics we see coming out of Silicon Valley today. That's sort of like, what is with these fucking like Nazi libertarian dudes? And I'm like, okay, well, read Malcolm's book because
Yeah, well, and they should read my book because I don't think they know what they're doing. I think if they like read it, they would have a much better idea of who they themselves are.
send them a few copies.
Right?
Thanks,
They can
Malcolm.
afford them. They should buy their own.
Come back sometime to talk to us more. I appreciate it.
Definitely, we'll do the next hour another time.
Yeah, we'll do
All
it
right.
on acid, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Later, Malcolm.
Thanks, David.